Hi, everyone. I'm Juliana Costa. I will be your moderator and discussant of this panel on international organizations and development cooperation. Today, we will have two presentations. My name is Juliana Costa. I'm a visitant professor of Federal University of São Paulo and associate researcher from Articulação Sul, which is I don't know. Sorry, we will have a technical problem. I don't know why. Okay. Like why I am saying, we will have two presentations today from Patricia Rinaldi and from Kelly Cristina. They will present in 20 minutes each, and then I will comment their presentations. And during my comments, the floor will be open for questions and comments in our chat, and I will see what are you saying, and then I will pass the floor to the two panelists today. Okay. I hope we have a good afternoon and a good discussion. One more time, I would like to thank all the staff from the conference, and especially Osmani Porto de Oliveira. So I will give the floor and the words for Patricia Rinaldi, okay? Patricia, it's your turn.
Juliana, for introducing me. Thank you also for coordinating this panel. I also would like to thank the conveners of this conference for the opportunity of presenting this research. So just give me a minute so I can share with you my presentation. There you go. So hello everybody, I am Patricia Rinaldi from FACAM, Faculdade de Campinas. My paper will discuss the United Nations role in the mainstreaming of SouthSouth Cooperation in policy transfer and development diffusion and cooperation. Actually, I covered this issue in my PhD research from an international relations perspective. So my objective with this paper is actually my first attempt to establish a dialogue between an international relations point of view and the main issues raised by the field of policy diffusion. So in my presentation today, I decided not to present all the United Nations normative and institutional landmarks that I cover in my paper, but rather to highlight the main issues I believe are interesting to establish this dialogue. So, when it comes to policy diffusion and transfer for development cooperation, there are many studies attesting the important role of international organizations. As put by Dolowitz et al., international organizations can work as ideational forums, as policy agenda shapers, and as agents of institutionalization. And that's also the case of the United Nations. It is well documented that as a result of political initiatives from southern countries in the 1960s, that the UN had to reinvent itself. From an international organization that in its early years had a very limited mandate in terms of promoting development, the UN had to become an agent of policy transfer and diffusion with the creation of the United Nations Development Programme in 1965, and with the subsequent creation of other UN agencies and programs focused on the promotion of technical activities for development. But the main problem was that throughout its history, many of the United Nations technical development projects have presented counterproductive results. because these projects were mainly based on wrong diagnosis or misperceptions of the real needs of developing countries. So many of the UN technical initiatives had little impact on local reality, superficial training, and the absence of real knowledge transfer and capacity building to developing countries. So in this paper, I present how Southern countries have historically relied on the United Nations as the main forum for the articulation of a new paradigm of policy transfer and diffusion to answer to these problems of projects based on wrong diagnosis or projects with superficial trainings and with the lack of real knowledge transfer. So for Southern countries, this alternative to make UN development activities more effective would be integrating South-South cooperation in the United Nations work. So that's the main topic I would like to discuss in this presentation. And for that, I just would like to provide some initial definitions. Let's first define South-South cooperation, which is a very difficult modality to define, but based on the three main United Nations high-level documents on the issue, which are the Buenos Aires Plan of Action of 1978, the Nairobi Outcome of 2009, and the Buenos Aires Outcome of 2019, we can define South-South cooperation from the United Nations perspective as a modality of cooperation in which developing countries establish horizontal partnerships among them for the sharing of knowledge, training, technology, and expertise in order to facilitate their development. South-South cooperation is also a modality guided by some specific principles, such as the respect for national sovereignty, national ownership of development projects, independence, equality, non-conditionality, no interference in domestic affairs, and especially mutual benefit in development projects. So, due to Southern countries' claim to make United Nations technical cooperation more responsive to their development needs, since the 1970s, the UN has assisted developing countries so they could deepen the use of South-South cooperation. But it is actually in the early 2000s, under the leadership of the so-called emerging powers such as Brazil, India, South Africa, Brazil, due to this leadership of these emerging powers in the early 2000s, the UN really started a process of promoting this modality, which is known in the organization as the mainstreaming of South-South cooperation. For the United Nations, mainstreaming means making South-South cooperation practical by integrating it into everything the UN does in the area of development. But the main issue is that South-South cooperation is not a natural task for the United Nations. To make use of Southern knowledge, expertise, it's not something organic for the United Nations. So, to make South-South cooperation an integral part of the United Nations work, that would require 3 steps, which encompasses the concept of mainstreaming. First, it would require assess current corporate policies and practices for development. So from this assessment, the UN could introduce South-South cooperation in its policies and practices in development projects. Second, it would require raise the awareness of UN member states and UN staff about the benefits of South-South cooperation. Because currently, these actors, they actually do not know exactly what South-South cooperation is and what are its main advantages or the potential use of South-South cooperation. And 3, mainstreaming South-South cooperation in the UN would require to promote a series of activities for capacity building. So the United Nations could translate the principles, the normative principles of South-South cooperation into practice by really creating development capacity based on Southern knowledge, expertise, and Southern solutions. So with these two definitions in mind, the main question I address in my paper is, what are the main advantages and challenges of the UN as an agent of mainstreaming South-South cooperation? Or in other terms, why do Southern countries need the UN support to promote South-South cooperation? What is the value added of the UN when it comes to the integration of South-South cooperation in its practices? So I argue in my paper that incorporating South-South cooperation across the UN has presented a mixed record. On one hand, the UN has both the norm setting and the coverage power to place South-South cooperation as a priority in its global development agenda. And it also has the power to institutionalize Southern practices in the field. So that would be the main advantage. Southern countries can rely on the United Nations power to define norms and agendas, and they can rely on the institutional coverage of the organization to really upscale South-South cooperation as a universal practice in the field of development cooperation. But on the other hand, political disputes between northern and southern countries, as well as the attitudinal barriers of the UN Secretariat, have made the mainstreaming of South-South cooperation largely unsystematic. Most of the UN South-South cooperation initiatives are individual or done in an ad hoc or case-by-case basis, because there is still a lot of resistance inside the UN, especially from northern countries and part of the UN Secretariat, to understand and recognize the value of South-South cooperation. So instead of promoting this modality as a systemic part of its work, still South-South cooperation is not business as usual for the UN, so to speak. To prove this argument, I'd like now to briefly discuss in more detail the advantages and challenges in mainstreaming South-South cooperation across the UN in the early 2000s. So, in terms of advantages, two characteristics of the UN facilitates the process of mainstreaming South-South cooperation. The first one is that the UN is unique in a sense that it has a powerful multilateral approach. The United Nations is the most universal organization in the international system. So differently from other organizations such as the OECD-DAC or the World Bank, the UN truly works as a universal forum and agenda shaper for development policies. So with this multilateral approach, the Global South has chosen the UN as the forum per excellence in setting the norms to better define the concept and to standardize the practice of South-South cooperation. And the main example about this important advantage of the UN is that the organization included in 2005 South-South cooperation as an important tool for the implementation of the Millennium Development Goals. As you may know, in 2000, South-South cooperation was not considered as a means of implementation of these goals when the UN adopted the MDGs. So in its original concept, MDGs were mainly conceived to be implemented in a North-South basis. So, due to demands of Southern countries, in 2005, South-South cooperation was recognized universally as a means of implementation of the MDGs. And that was very important because then the UN started to make sure that its development projects focused on the achievement of different MDGs would first consider to use Southern experts, knowledge, and solutions in the implementation of its projects. So, besides this universal approach of the UN institutional coverage and capacity in the field is also an advantage to put South-South cooperation in practice. Just to have an idea, only the United Nations Development Program has more than 170 offices in all these countries, and most of them are Southern countries. So by making use of this institutional presence of the United Nations in most Southern countries, that would facilitate the systematization of Southern knowledge in terms of making use of the UN field presence to systematize Southern lessons, Southern best practices to solve Southern development problems. This coverage in the field also facilitates the matchmaking between Southern experts and demanders to the achievement of the UN global goals. So we can see why Southern countries have chosen historically the UN as the forum per excellence to promote South-South cooperation, because the support of the United Nations with both the norm setting and institutional support, Southern countries could rely on the United Nations structure to make this modality a real universal practice in the field of development cooperation. But of course, despite of these advantages, there are many challenges. As many UN reports show, its efforts to prioritize South-South cooperation in its development policies has remained ad hoc and inadequate to leverage South-South cooperation to a universal level. And I highlight in my paper two factors that challenges the capacity of the United Nations in better mainstreaming South-South cooperation. The first challenge is the lack of support of OECD DAC countries to the mainstreaming of South-South cooperation across the UN. As we know, the OECD DAC agenda is dominant in the UN development activities because these countries are the main donors of the United Nations development system. So from the perspective of OECD DAC countries, South-South cooperation is mainly based on rhetorical principles, and it lacks a systematic approach to really become a means of implementation of the UN development agenda. For OECD DAC countries, it's not possible so far to monitor the real effectiveness of South-South cooperation in promoting development. So the problems raised by the OECD DAC countries inside UN forums affect the universal recognition of South-South cooperation as an effective paradigm for the achievement of the UN development agenda. Besides the problem concerning the North-South divide in the UN, the second challenge I believe is very interesting to explore is the attitudinal barriers of the UN Secretariat towards South-South cooperation. The UN Secretariat has historically operated with the general idea that its agencies and programs must own the development solutions, usually emulated from the experience of the OECD DAC countries. And the UN staff should be the main responsible to implement and transfer these solutions to developing countries. So the UN Secretariat has historically learned that it's simply a matter of understanding developing countries' logistics to take a development solution and transfer it to a developing country. That's why UN reports show that most of UN staff lack knowledge about the existing human and material capabilities in Southern countries. There is this preconceived notion that specialists from developing countries are poorly qualified for UN work, or that equipment, services, and development solutions lack quality or technological advancements. These attitudinal barriers has resulted in low hiring of specialists, equipment, and services from developing countries, even in cases where qualified resources are available locally in developing countries. So UN staff in the field actually lacks knowledge about the reality of developing countries. As put by a UN report, UN organizations that were used to implementing projects that simply require knowledge of developing countries' logistics, now with South-South cooperation, are required to understand the economic, the social, the historical, and the cultural realities of developing countries. So let's just jump to the conclusion, because I think I have already, I've said too much. So just to conclude, I believe the United Nations system is unique in mainstreaming South-South cooperation in the sense that it has a powerful norm setting and advocacy role. But despite these important normative and institutional achievements, translating the idea of SouthSouth cooperation into practice has been largely unsystematic. Even though the United Nations has historically supported the agenda of developing countries, even though the United Nations is the best forum developing countries have to vocalize their development agenda, the organization still remains a Western institution when it comes to the source of its development ideas, the composition and the mentality of its staff, and as a consequence in the design of its development policies. So I believe that the UN still needs to learn the value of SouthSouth cooperation. And for that, it has to improve its knowledge and understanding about the functioning of SouthSouth cooperation initiatives. And the UN needs to build up the capacity to better identify and roster Southern policy solutions. So that would be it for now. I'm looking forward to answering your questions or comments. Thank you, and back to you, Juliana.
Now I will give the floor to Kelly Cristina. Kelly Cristina, you have 20 minutes. I encourage our audience to make their questions or comments on our chat, okay? And then I will pass to our panelists. Thank you for your presence here. You have 20 minutes, Kelly, okay? Are you ready?
Hello, everyone. I'm Kelly. I'm from Federal University of Minas Gerais. I'm a master candidate in political science. I will present the paper, Southern African Development Community, Regional Integration and Development. And this paper attempts to describe the relationship between regional integration and development based in the description of socioeconomic development indicators of the 10 founding countries of the Southern African Development Community. The socioeconomic variables used is the Human Development Index, the gross domestic product, and the rate of the adult population between 15 and 49 years old living with HIV. The choice of these indicators is due to the fact that the development of a country beyond the economic issue, without, however, ignoring this aspect. Two central concepts in this paper are regional integration and development. Regional integration process involves policies aimed at eliminating barriers to the circulation of goods, capital, people, and services. It is important to note that as integration advances, the agenda expands to include the development of common policies at the micro and macro levels. Regional integration is a great tool for creating intra-block trade and encouraging the industrialization of countries. In Africa, economic communities are understood as a way of leveraging the capacity of small countries. In addition, regional integration and consequently inter-Africa trade would contribute to structural transformation and economic and social development, in addition to increasing the bargaining power in a globalized world. About the creation of SADC, two integration initiatives preceded it directly. The Frontline States Alliance was created in 1975 in a period whose main concern in the region was the anti-colonial struggle. In the following years, the economy became an aspect that required attention, which resulted in the creation of the South African Development Coordination Conference in 1998. the SADC CFLS remained as separate forums, the first as responsible for economic coordination, and the second as political and military support. Regional integration is the desired objective based on the principle that free trade is fundamentally positive. However, has a fundamental discussion about the roles played by the state and the market in the development process. Some authors reject the neoliberal paradigm that minimizes the state's action in favor of the markets for the development effort in Africa. They argued that the selective and coordination intervention of the state is fundamental to direct market forces to achieve the target regional objectives. The expanded scope of the objectives of the SADC Treaty, which includes environment protection, consolidation of cultural, historical, and social ties, common political institutions, self-sustained development, promotion of peace and security, in addition to poverty reduction and economic growth, allows us to infer a concern on the part of the community with development beyond financial aspects. The Consolidated Treaty of the SADC brings an expansion of the community's objectives in relation to the 1992 treaty. It is possible to notice the expansion of the community's scope and consequently of what is possible to be understood as development. In the Consolidated Treaty of the SADC, it is possible to identify a concern with gender equity through the mainstream gender in the process of the community building objective, as well as the fight against sexually transmitted infections such as HIV. So this story is characterized as descriptive, using bibliographic and documentary research. The descriptive character is derived from the purpose of the research, which is to verify the relationship between some economic indicators and the regional integration bloc. Currently, SADC has 16 members countries. However, for this research, it was decided to include only the 10 founding members in the analysis due to the period of time covered. The data used covers the period between 1992 and 2018 and was collected on websites of international institutions. The Human Development Index was collected in the UNDP website. The gross domestic product growth rate and the rate of the adult population living with HIV were collected in the World Bank website. The Human Development Index is the average of the key dimension of human development: a long and healthy life, knowledge, and a decent standard of living, and was created to demonstrate that people's capacity should be the main factor in assessing the development of a state, and not just economic growth. The GDP is the sum of all national production plus taxes on products and reduced subsidies not included in the value of products, regardless of whether the value will revert to national or foreign institution. The variable rate of the adult population living with HIV was chosen because it is a variable of socioeconomic development and because it's in the Consolidated Treaty of SADC. The fight against HIV is one of the objectives. This table shows the variation in the HDI level of the SADC founding members countries between the years 1992 and 2018, with the exception of Angola, whose HDI started to be measured in 1999. From the HDI values, it is identified that some countries had a steady evolution of the HDI, such as Angola and Mozambique, while several countries showed an increase in the index, followed by a reduction to then increase again, such as Zimbabwe and Eswatini. Among the 10 countries in the analysis, the one with the best HDI in 2018 was Botswana, while Mozambique showed the worst index. In 2018, the countries classified with an average human development index were those with HDI equal to or greater than 0.663 and less than 0.75. According to this classification, only Botswana and Namibia had an average HDI, while all the others were classified as low HDI. Um, this figure shows the GDP variation of the 10 SADC founding member states between 1992 and 2018. In this period, Zimbabwe was the country that showed the greatest variation in the value of GDP. This This figure shows the percentage of the adult population aged between 15 and 49 years living with HIV in each of the 10 founding members countries of SADC. The incidence of HIV in the population is an important piece of information because, in addition to being an indicator of socioeconomic development in the country, it also indicates whether the community is managing to fulfill its proposed objectives. In this case, the fight against HIV. As can be seen, Lesotho and Eswatini are the countries with the highest prevalence of HIV in SADC and in the world, including a steady increase in the number of people with HIV. Although Lesotho has started a slight decrease from 2015 and Eswatini from 2017. Zimbabwe, on the other hand, has witnessed a reduction in the number of people with HIV since 1997. Angola is the country among the 10 evaluated with the lowest population index with HIV. Unfortunately, however, the country has been witnessing an increase in the number of infected people since 1992. Despite all this, it is important to highlight that it is not possible to say whether the numbers of infected people are actually decreasing or if there is a failure in the diagnosis. That is, if the population is not being tested. The same can be said about Angola, whether the number of people living with HIV is increasing or whether the population is being tested in greater numbers and frequency than before. Unfortunately, these variables were not enough to suggest that the regional integration process had a positive impact on the socioeconomic indicators of member states. Um, Thank you, Blan.
Thank you, Kelly. Uh, good presentations. Your papers are so interesting, and I will comment this some highlights to your papers and for your to continue your researches on this subjects on international relations and development cooperation. Okay. First, I would like to comment the paper of Patricia from UFMG. Patricia, just a question before. Are you already finished your thesis or not?
Yes, I defended my PhD thesis in 2018, so it's part of a concluded research. But of course, your comments are very welcome because the intention is to use this material to dialogue with different fields. So feel free to make your comments in that sense.
Okay, thank you. So I will make comments to help you to continue your research in this theme, in this subject. So feel free to use or not, but I think it will enrich your paper or your future papers to be presented. So I think, first of all, would be useful for your research to have to mark. I don't know if in your thesis if you had use theoretical mark or theoretical perspective, but use the discussion on southern epistemologies or epistemologies from the south, using authors like Boaventura de Souza Santos, which discuss exactly the thing of the global south perspective, and to embody the knowledge and experiences of the global south, because south is seen as a metaphor of exclusion, the silencing and destruction of peoples and knowledges. But we have production and knowledge useful for our research. We don't need only to use the Western researchers. We have a good perspective and good authors from South. So the epistemology from the South use and want to bring this perspective for our research. So it's the idea that within the global north norms and things, you have a political and intellectual exclusion of South, and they are they don't capture our southern perspectives. So you have to use this kind of perspective in your research, understanding like this perspective say that the world is much broader than the Western understanding of the world. So the alternatives are not lacking, because we have a good perspective from the South. We have alternatives. We have to think in alternatives. So and think that the epistemic diversity of the world is infinite. So no general theory can hope to understand it, even the epistemologists from the South. So we have to promote an ecology of knowledge, combining with intercultural translation. So it's good to use this perspective, so we will enrich your dialogue with policy transfers and policy diffusion perspective, theories, and authors. So to discuss the South, not only make a historical perspective or historical mark on the evolution of South, because this we have so much papers and things saying that. So we have to advance on that and to make things for the future and to appropriate of our knowledge of we have accumulated in our research from the South and of the South is a good thing to for you to think and read about these kind of perspectives. I know. I think this perspective is the main perspective for Southern researchers. Sorry, for us to bring this discussion on our papers, because we only always use Western authors and Western researchers. So let's start to use researchers from South to make this production really be spreaded. So for everyone, I think we need in the South to use Southern authors. So epistemologists from the South is useful for that. Even Boaventura is not from the South; he's from the North, but he had a good dialogue with Southern authors. So I think it's good for you to think about this perspective in your future research, doing this dialogue between epistemologists from the South and policy diffusion, because the policy diffusion debate have a lot of authors from North, but have authors from the South. So it's I think it will enrich your perspective and will bring new things for us to think and for us to know. So I think it's good you do this for your future research. Second, I think in your paper could be useful to have a brief discussion of South-South cooperation concept. Why I'm saying that? Because South-South cooperation concept is not a consensus. So even between North-Southern countries, we have different perspectives and interpretations of what is South-South cooperation. Like what I'm saying, China and India think financial cooperation is South-South cooperation, like grants, like loans. Brazil don't think that. So it's a good discussion. I'm just saying from this BRICS perspective, but we have another countries that have different perspectives of what is South-South cooperation. This is useful because when we don't have a concept, it's difficult for UN to organize a platform or policies to transfer, because what is South-South cooperation? So this is a landmark that for us is interesting. For some authors, this is not a useful discussion, because the beauty of South-South cooperation is this diversity. For others, not. there is other authors that don't that disagree with this. So it's this is a good discussion, but it's not to take a long time with this, but just to say what you are thinking about the South-South cooperation concept. What concept of South-South cooperation are you using, or UN is using in their documents, in their meetings, or everything that they do? So I think it's good to think about that. And you can use authors like Chakrabarti, Emma Maudsley, that which which use this kind of debate for you to know. In your paper, I think it's good for you to describe or use the platform developed by UN, which is called South-South Galaxy Platform, that is available for all of us. That is a platform to policy diffusion. It's an example of UN policy diffusion. You said something about that, but you don't take a long time with this. So this platform is an example of UN role in policy diffusion. Now they are doing something like that with COVID-19. So because they are putting in this platform what countries are doing to fight this pandemic. So it's a good way to use and to diffuse policies. It's not the way we had a paper which discussed that these don't not from this platform, but platform from UNPD, that sometimes this kind of thing don't take or don't take the target that they want. They don't have this kind of, because policymakers won't consult these platforms, which is the interest of United Nations, not only researchers or other academic people. So it's a good example of an effort that United Nations are doing to make policy transfer and to put these initiatives for other countries. Okay, so I think you will be useful for you to have this this kind of discussion in your paper. Okay, so but your paper it's good. You make an historical perspective with what United Nations did, all the documents. So it's a useful perspective and a useful research for all of us. So just I'm saying things for you to continually researching about South-South cooperation and this link between policy transfer and development cooperation, because I think this is the most important thing and the most important objective of South-South cooperation is make a policy transfer. Brazilian perspective of South-South cooperation is that capacities development is a policy transfer. So it's good to link these two literatures, because I think that they are so many things and points in common that we need to link this. This conference is for that, but is good for us to think about these links. So I think your paper is good, and just comments for you to continue your research. Okay. For Kelly, your paper, like the paper from Patricia, is good. You have many data for your variables, so I think it's a good way to think. I have two comments for your research. It's that you make some of regionalization literature, but I think you could link this kind of literature and perspective with policy diffusion literature. Make use or bring authors that do this debate between regionalization and policy transfer. If this could have a link, or if regionalization influence the policy diffusion, and how this could be, I think it's important. I think it's the main target of your paper. So I think it's good for you to make this link between regionalization and policy transfer, or bring us authors that already make this link between these two perspectives. So I think it could be useful for you. I know that your method is a descriptive method, okay, but for your research question, that is, if regionalization influence or had an impact in some variables, some indexes, I think could be useful for you to think. I don't know if you have familiarity with this kind of methods, but use some statistical method for your question. Because when we make causal questions, we more likely to use statistical method, because uh, they are better for us to answer our question if there is or not an influence between our variables. So I think it could be useful for you, because when we use just descriptive method, we don't know what have an impact in indexes. We just showing that the index have this profile and have this evolution, but what is the impact of regionalization in these indexes? So if regionalization are doing policy transfer, another way for you to construct your argument, if you don't have familiarity with statistical methods, is to use some examples of policy transfer made by the regional bloc. if they have something, if they had a department on that, or if some country helped other country of this regional bloc, could be an example of that. So you can put some examples or initiatives made by the bloc in this index that could be could be a solution for your question, because your paper have a lot of data, so it's so good. This is an effort that it's difficult to make, even when we talk about even more if we talk about African countries that we have a difficult to know their data. So I think this is useful. I'm not saying for you to throw all this data. No, use this data, linking with this perspective. So if they have something in some initiatives of what they are doing in HIV combat, what they are doing with hunger or other index that you use it. You use the research on HIV perspective. So what they are doing in HIV, what are the initiatives of the countries. So I think it's good for you to enrich your paper, because your paper had a lot of data. We are, whoa, it's good. But what is the policy transfer between these countries? They are doing this kind of policy or not? So you have these two ways to to resolve your problem, using a statistic method, moving from another method, or putting some examples of this kind of policy transfer, or saying if they don't have, so they are not doing anything together. I don't think it's the way they are doing. I think they do something together. So it's a good way for you to show us, because we don't have so much information about African countries in the other southern countries. So it's good for us to have this research, because we are not in the mainstream of international relations. Even in SouthSouth Cooperation, we have the people that research Brazil, India, and China, using China, India, and Brazil, taking or going to Africa or influencing Africa. But what is the perspective from Africa? I think your paper could show us and give us this perspective. They are they create a block. They create something, and what they are doing with this, it is a way to do policy transfer or not. So I think this is a good discussion for you to do. Okay, I will see if we have comments and questions. We have one question for Patricia. Remembering you, if you have some more questions, please don't be shy to send us here in chat, okay? Roberta Machado asked Patricia what to expect from SouthSouth Cooperation today with the pandemic and the race for the vaccines. This is a good question for you, Patricia, and it's $1 million question for SouthSouth Cooperation. But I think it's a good question. So anyone could have questions or comments now? So I give the floor for Patricia.
Thank you, Juliana, for your very pertinent comments. I think the most interesting thing that we can do in these conferences is actually exchanging views and exchanging perspectives. And your comments were very interesting because from my standpoint, from my international relations perspective, my general work in my PhD research that I defended, as I told you, in 2018, the idea was to make a contribution to a project that was called the United Nations Intellectual History, which was a project with a series of books and researches coordinated by the Ralph Bunty Institute of International Studies in New York. So in my period there as a visiting scholar, I was supposed to contribute to the UN intellectual history, but from the perspective of the Global South. So that's why I think it's so important to tell the history of the United Nations from the perspective of the Global South. Because as you may know, as I see from your experience, you work together with the UN Office for SouthSouth Cooperation, with UNDP. SouthSouth Cooperation has historically been a sector in the UN work. Just like gender in the 70s or environmental issues in the 70s, SouthSouth Cooperation in the UN is pretty much a sector, an area of work that still lacks integration with all the UN levels of work in the field of development. So the history of the documents, the main UN landmarks that affect SouthSouth Cooperation, even though they are really obvious for us that research SouthSouth Cooperation, it's actually not obvious for the United Nations people. It's not, except for people from the UN Office of SouthSouth Cooperation. They may know the greatest UN landmarks in the field of development, but they probably will not know the main landmarks regarding the history of the South in this organization, pretty much because it's an isolated sector. So in terms of a theoretical perspective, I think you're completely right in saying the importance of bringing theories and theoretical perspectives from the South, which are very useful. My intention was really to show how Southern ideas have contributed to the United Nations intellectual history, understanding the United Nations in a constructive sense, as a forum to the generation and to the spread of ideas globally and universally in the field of development. So your comment is really good in this sense. In my PhD research, I actually relied my analysis on constructivism, combining it with the Maudsley gift theory analysis to understand the particularities of SouthSouth Cooperation. And I also used the perspective of Vijay Prashad, which is an Indian author, to understand these attempts of the South of making the United Nations a forum that could be more responsive to internationalizing or globalizing the Southern agenda for development. So I totally agree with you that it's crucial to mobilize Southern authors to understand the use of SouthSouth Cooperation globally. And that's why I think this historical approach in terms of the evolution of ideas in the UN is so important, because this knowledge is pretty obvious for us that research SouthSouth Cooperation, but it's not obvious for people that work in the United Nations with the development agenda, because SouthSouth Cooperation is not business as usual for them. It's just a segment in which it depends on individual initiatives of some UN staff, of some UN leadership that knows something from a Southern country, knows some Southern initiative, and it's not the result of a systematical approach. And that's why I believe in the 2000, the Global South has chosen the UN as the forum, as you said, to discuss a definition for South-South cooperation. As you mentioned, there is not a single definition when it comes to Southern countries' foreign policy. Each Southern country defines South-South cooperation from a different foreign policy perspective. And the United Nations would be actually the forum in which not only Southern countries, but together with Northern countries, it would be possible to create a common or a consensual concept of South-South cooperation. But for those who knows how consensus work at the United Nations, consensus is more about defining things that aren't instead of defining what things are. And I think that's a good example of how South-South cooperation is defined in the United Nations high-level documents. South-South cooperation is more defined by what it isn't. For instance, in UN documents, it isn't ODA, it isn't official aid for development, it isn't traditional cooperation. And there is this gap, and it's on purpose, because Southern countries want a broader concept to accommodate, on one hand, their collective interests in the United Nations, but on the other hand, a flexible concept that they could bring differences when they define South-South cooperation on their own foreign policies. So I totally agree with you that the issue of definitions is so important. And I think this flexibility, this gap that is so important for Southern countries is also a weakness in terms of negotiations with Northern countries. Because in my PhD research, I had the opportunity to interview different diplomats from different countries. And when interviewing diplomats from European Union countries or from the US or Canada, the main critique they have is that we don't know what South-South cooperation is. And if we don't know what are the criteria to measure South-South cooperation, we cannot measure its efficiency. We cannot measure its value for money, because these categories are very important for OECD DAC countries. So I believe South-South cooperation in the UN also means dialoguing with the North and with the dominant agenda of OECD DAC countries. So I totally agree with you that when it comes to concepts, it's a very important discussion, because in the UN, they are not discussing academic concepts. In academia, we have to provide a concept that is logical, that is round, that is circle, that has a beginning and an end. But in the UN, concepts are political, so they don't actually need to be as coherent as we expect in academia. And that was a very interesting finding I had in my PhD research when interviewing UN diplomats, is that while for us from academia, it's very important to have a very concise and clear definition, for many diplomats negotiating the UN, it's exactly its vagueness that's important in the political game inside the UN and inside the dispute of development agendas. So my research covered mainly the early 2000s. So that's why I didn't mention South-South Cooperation Galaxy, which was created in 2019. It's a very recent platform, but of course it relied on previous UN experiences, especially the South-South Gate, which was a partnership to systematize assets and technology from developing countries. But it's really good to see how from the SDGs on, from 2015, when the 2030 agenda was adopted, it was really possible to upscale South-South cooperation in the UN agenda. And I agree with you that South-South Cooperation Galaxy is the main example on how the UN work has improved in these recent years when it comes to supporting countries to policy diffusion. I think that would be it for now. We have the question. I don't know, do I have a few minutes to comment the questions of South cooperation and the pandemic?
Yes.
Okay. So as Juliana said, I think that's also the $1 million question when it comes to SouthSouth Cooperation, because the COVID-19 pandemic has clearly shown the vulnerabilities of the Global South, including its very fragile health systems, its huge digital divide, and the lack of hygiene and infrastructure and sanitation. So while developed countries, northern countries have spent trillions in research and economic measures, very few developing countries could afford similar packages, similar investments. And that's when it comes the importance of South-South cooperation. The United Nations Office for South-South Cooperation has put in place important policies to counter the COVID-19 effects in southern countries. I think the first important measure was using the very small but very important United Nations Fund for South-South Cooperation to the purchase of medical equipment, ventilators, and provide these medical equipments to small island developing countries that were the first affected by the pandemic. But I think the strongest measure was the efforts of the UN to sustain what I believe is the strongest asset of South-South cooperation, which is the exchange of national experiences. And for South-South cooperation, this exchange of experiences was mainly done on a personal basis, with travels and visits, and suddenly it had to be digitalized, and all these interactions and meaningful exchanges had to transferred to an online setting. So that's when I believe the galaxy, the South-South Cooperation Galaxy, supported by the UN, was so important because they have conducted many important seminars in different themes on how southern countries could systematize their knowledge, their solutions to better respond to the pandemics. But I do believe that the most important thing was the COVAX partnership. So we've seen that the response to the pandemics was mainly national. Nationalism was the main way countries responded to the pandemics. And I believe South-South cooperation is a very important tool to bring multilateralism back on the game when it comes to responding to this pandemic. So I do believe if we reaffirm the values of South-South cooperation, the global framework for a global access to a vaccine, and especially combating vaccine nationalism, combating intellectual property exclusiveness when it comes to the vaccines, would be fundamental to reduce the gap between northern and southern countries when it comes to the pandemic response. That would be it. Thank you, Juliana.
Okay. I will make. Oh, sorry, my cam. I can. I will make some comments on this kind of discussion that we are having here. I went when I with representing Articulação Sul. I went to UN Development Cooperation Forum at ECOSOC, and later we have a team which was on BAPA Plus 40 conference. And what we have seen is that this kind of awareness of having a concept is for us, like you said, for us that which who research South-South cooperation is not a thing that policymakers want to think or want to have. They have other things to have in mind, that they have in mind. So it's not a thing, it's not a subject for them. So it's pretty clear for me that this is a thing that us from research, which want to know and want to have, but they don't have this kind of a thing to worry about. And what you said about measurement, because my research, and not only my research, but my work on Articulação Sul is on South-South Cooperation measurement. I made, and I work with another colleague in an article that we submitted to Third World Quarterly, that we made this comparative study on measurement of South-South cooperation in Latin America. I had another study which I made for a consultant for UN, which I compare all the measurement methods on South-South cooperation. Even the OECD method, TOSD, and before the DAC measurement, that it was the ODA method, for ODA method. So the difficulty for this measurement is because if we have all countries saying different things of what they consider South-South cooperation, we will have different methods to measure this. So we won't have something to compare, because they think South-South cooperation is something and another is other. And we have, when we think about Brazil, that our South-South cooperation is based on development capacities. So it's so much more difficult to monetize and to measure, because what, like Patricia said, our South-South cooperation is personal, is travels from our civil servants, public servants, to other southern countries to share their knowledge. This is the main objective and the main thing of our South-South cooperation. And this is a thing that is difficult to measure, because we don't know the impact of this knowledge share in in the policymakers in policies. So for Brazil, because if we just look in the amount, Brazilian cooperation could be seen as marginal, because if we put just travels and things like conference, it's not a good a big amount like China, like India, but its impact in communities are so huge. So this is a difficult when we say and we talk about measurement. Because of that, it's difficult for us to measure this impact, or to compare initiatives that are so different. Initiatives from Brazil is different from China, and now we are asking if China are doing much more like aid that is different from South-South cooperation, or they are more likely northern countries using money more than development capacities. So this kind of thing is difficult for us, and we need to show or to bring. So measurement now, it's a good debate on not only on researchers, but in the UN and with people from United Nations SouthSouth Cooperation Office, because we don't have this potentially comparison between these countries. So because even Brazil, China, and India, they don't have measurement methods, platforms for us to know what they do. Brazil's had Cobrade, but Cobrade, between the years, the policy briefs are so different between in methodological perspective. They become more qualitative and more descriptive than they were in the beginning. So it's difficult for us. It's a challenge for Brazil and for India and for China to bring this information. So it's a way for us, not the comparison is not for saying China is the best and Brazil is just the third country in this three countries that is most important in South-South cooperation. No, it's not for that. It's just for us to know what they are doing, to have a profile of their South-South cooperation activities, and for us and for policymakers to see what things that are having good impact, what things that are not. So this is something that we need to have, and measurement is a good way for that. But for a while, if we don't have a South-South cooperation concept, so this is a thing that would harm the measure platform, a unified platform to measure South-South cooperation. This is a dream now, because we are so far from that, because we even don't have the national platforms for that. So to have a platform with all South-South cooperation initiatives, it will be a dream. But now the South-South Galaxy platform, I think it's an objective that they want in the future, because of the works and research that they are doing on that. So I think in the future we could, but this measurement debate now, it's so important, because we will have another way from OECD to measure their cooperation that is TOSD, that is different from the other perspective. That is more that is another debate that listen this kind of platform, the TOSD, listen the beneficiary, not only the donor. So it's good to see the impact. Things like that is interesting. TOSD is a different measurement thing than the ODA, that is the traditional way of OECD measured their North-South cooperation. So it's a good it's better than ODA, I think, but they are just doing some policy briefs on some countries to see if this methodology is working well and what adjustments they want to do and things like that. We have another initiatives here in Latin America is from ECLAC, CEPAL for us, which are thinking about this kind of platform or a methodology using what they call national accounts and doing something in the budget of the countries. So it's a good initiative, but it's still in the beginning. Another that we have that from they completed 10 years is Cegib's platforms and policy briefs, which measure, like I said, SouthSouth Cooperation from inter-America countries. So it's good, Ibero-American countries, sorry. It's good, but this methodology only shows the number of projects and in what areas, to what beneficiaries. We don't have a more deep perspective of what they are doing and how much these cooperation are costing for this country. And this is it's a methodology, but we don't have a picture of what is the real SouthSouth Cooperation. So I think it's good. But okay, I will take the floor, go to Kelly for their comments on what I said.
And thank you, Juliana. I was waiting for comments to improve the paper, and honestly, I hadn't thought of those points of linking regionalism and policy transfer literature, nor choose examples that would enrich the paper. So I don't have a reply. I want just to thank you for your careful reading and helpful comments.
Okay, anyone from our audience could wants to make some comments? I just compliment the Patricia's answer for the Roberta's question, that in SouthSouth Cooperation, I think we are seeing that not Brazil, but China and India, two southern countries that are so much important for the production of vaccines. So, and between them, we had different perspectives of this kind of thing, because India proposed in WTO, World Trade Organization, to break the intellectual property of COVID vaccine. And Brazil first, in the first meeting, was against. It's so different from our, like Patricia said, of foreign policies. It's so different from our perspective and foreign policy in the past, which together with India and South Africa, they break the intellectual property of HIV medicines. So it's a good example of how foreign policy affect this kind of alliances and this kind of perspective. So Brazil and India was partners, but now don't. But Brazil changed his mind because we need vaccines that which are being produced in India. So we changed it now in the last meeting of the World Trade Organization. Brazil don't show any objection of this kind of debate. So it's a step. It's a good thing for us from Brazil to see, because for me it was so strange that southern country are against the break of intellectual property of the vaccine. So I think it's good. And like Patricia said, it's the subject of our panel. We are having an international organization, World Health Organization, doing something which is development cooperation, that is the COVAX. COVAX is a good example of how an international organization could help countries that is from South that have which having some difficulties to have access of medicines, of equipment, to have this access. Here in our region, we have OPAS that is doing a good job. In the beginning of this pandemic in Brazil, they did a lot of donations to Brazilian government of equipment and medicines, mostly equipment, since we don't have medicines that are a cure for COVID. So it's a good way to see how international organizations could be a bridge between southern countries and could help these countries to have cooperation between them. So I think I will finish our panel saying that we have an opportunity, and this pandemic could be an example of how international organizations, not only World Health Organization, but others like UN Office for SouthSouth Cooperation, UNDP, and all the international agencies that complete UN system, could be a bridge between southern countries. It's not a coincidence that I think now it's all the agencies from United Nations now have offices in China. Why that? Because they have money. They are interested in make South-South cooperation, and United Nations could be used to this. So what we call triangular cooperation could be useful. And I think the role of international organizations are so good, are so important to that. So I think my message, that is not an end of this discussion, is that international organizations have an important role in development cooperation. So I think it's good for us to think in that and to show examples of that, show the impacts of this development cooperation in communities, in policymakers. So this debate between international organizations, development cooperation, and policy transfer, I think it's so good for us to see that in the field, the things could be matched. It's not different perspectives. They are together in the field. And we need to bring this for our research, not using just policy transfer, not using just development cooperation literature, but bring this together, not only the international organizations literature. So I think our challenge is that put all this kind of literature and thinking together. So thank you for all of you. Was a good discussion. I loved this afternoon with all of you. And thank you one more time to Patricia, to Kelly, to conference staff, and Osmani for this discussion. I'm available for all of you to follow and to have this discussion in the future. Okay, bye.